I wanted to share some learning which has been kind of personally important to me. One, because I think it really changed the way I think about Purim in some important ways. And also because I'm teaching this in the name of a friend and colleague. So my classmate in my graduating class at Hebrew College, his name is Rabbi Ayalon Eliach. As he likes to say, I alone as in me by myself, I alone. He works for the Littman Kampfer Foundation for Living Torah, which is basically, he gets paid to think about Torah, which is great because he's brilliant. So this is some Torah that he kind of discovered personally, inspired by his experience as a young man. He grew up in the Orthodox world, where Purim is really serious, including the obligation or the tradition to drink on Purim, and actually really drink to excess. And I can identify with this too, because I remember I went on a high school trip to Israel, and I remember spending Purim in Jerusalem and taking a walk around town with some teachers who were just like, anyone who wants to go out, let's check it out. And we stopped by these Orthodox yeshivot where things were absolutely insane. There was, tables all around the outside of the the outside wall of the Beit Midrash, and there were people sitting at the tables drinking, and there were people dancing on top of the tables, and there were people passed out drunk underneath the tables, and the place was packed and just nuts. So my sort of wondering about why the connection between drinking and Purim and why this, sort of level of excess started in a similar fashion to my friend Ayalon's. But he's done some really, really amazing digging to unearth some explanation for this. So the spirit of Purim customs as we know them today is perhaps best summed up by an expression that comes from the book of Esther itself. So actually, I need to get my source sheet up here for you. All right. So it's source number 1 here, and it's towards the end of the book. There are 10 chapters in the book of Esther. And this one, source number 1, comes from the beginning of chapter 9. It says, "And so on the 13th day of the 12th month, that is the month of Adar, when the king's command and decree were to be executed, the very day on which the enemies of the Jews had expected to get them in their power, the opposite happened. And the Jews got their enemies in their power." And the Hebrew there, you can see I've bolded up here, "V'nahafochu." I mean, as they translate here, the opposite happened. And it literally means it was overturned, like it was turned upside down. So that's kind of the spirit of Purim summed up in one phrase. Things are upside down from the way things normally are. So in that spirit, let's start our discussion of the origin of the custom of drinking on Purim by looking at its end. Not literally its end, but how it ends up being formulated and understood by the medieval law codes that have become the basis for contemporary understandings of halacha. Okay, so source number 2 on your page comes from the Mishnah Torah, which is the law code formulated by Maimonides, who's also known as the Rambam, Rabbi Moses ben Maimon. And here he sums up in his section covering both Purim, that's what he calls the scroll of Esther, Megillat Esther, and Hanukkah, and he covers them both in one section. Rambam explains how is the obligation of this Purim meal, because he's just established that one of the things you're supposed to do on Purim is eat a meal, eat a fancy dinner. One should eat meats and prepare as pleasing a meal as they can. And one should drink wine until they become intoxicated and fall asleep from their intoxication. So this tracks for me. This tracks with what I saw in Jerusalem. People drinking so much wine or whatever alcohol is your pleasure, that you become intoxicated and in fact fall asleep from being too drunk. But the Rambam is not just making this up out of nowhere. He was criticized at the time for not showing his work, not citing sources explicitly. So part of our challenge as readers of law codes is to go back and figure out, what is the Rambam drawing on to make this claim. And here it's straightforward. And this, I would say, source number 3 at the bottom is the origin point for this custom. In the tractate called Megillah, as in Megillat Esther, the scroll of the book of Esther. We have this line here. Rava said, a person is obligated to become intoxicated with wine on Purim till he's so intoxicated that he does not know how to distinguish between cursed is Haman and blessed is Mordechai. Does that sound familiar? Maybe to a few folks? Okay. Okay. So what does this mean? That's kind of our fundamental question at the beginning. If this is the origin, everything else is implications. What are we actually supposed to do? Okay, maybe this is just a way of saying get really drunk. That's basically how the Rambam seems to understand it, right? Here the Hebrew, oh, I meant to bold this, I'm sorry. But the words that say until one does not know, ad delo yada, until one does not know, that's sort of the shorthand when you say ad delo yada in connection with Purim, you're talking about this obligation to drink. So maybe ad delo yada until you don't know the difference between cursed is Haman and blessed is Mordechai. Maybe it's just like sort of a measuring stick. It's like a pre-digital age breathalyzer test, right? You know you're drunk enough to have fulfilled your obligation if you can't tell the difference between Haman and Mordechai, right? That's how you know you're really plastered and you've really, fulfilled your mitzvah. Okay, maybe. And there are different explanations for why Rava might say this way, might formulate this obligation with specifically these words. Purim's a day when we turn things upside down, like we said, v'nahafochu, right? Which means we see them differently from how they normally are. Normally, we're sober, right? We're not drinking at 3:30 in the afternoon on Purim, and when we're learning about Purim, we drink, right? Also, wine plays a really prominent role in the story of Purim. The characters in Purim in the Purim story of Megillat Esther are drinking wine constantly. There's feasts all throughout. So maybe this obligation to drink on Purim is part of Rava's way of saying we should really step into that theme, right? Just the way we reenact the story through spiels and through hearing the Megillah. Maybe this is us almost like on Pesach when we eat the matzah as a way of sort of like actually experiencing what our ancestors escaping Egypt felt. Maybe that's sort of what we're supposed to do here. We're supposed to drink wine to excess, just like the characters did. These explanations don't really feel complete, though. For one thing, the Talmud essentially never wastes words. Despite being a very long collection of books, the Talmud is always trying to say about as much as it possibly can with about as few words as possible. So saying something specific like this, one should become so intoxicated that they don't know how to distinguish between cursed is Haman and blessed is Mordechai, should be already an indication there's something else going on here. Also, it doesn't really account for why we need a measurement or why this is even an obligation. They also look at this statement, these explanations like, okay, maybe this is just sort of a breathalyzer test or it's a thematic connection to the story. They just sort of are looking at this statement in isolation as just this one line. And they don't really take into account the other material that we have from this rabbi Rava. So Rava was what they call a Babylonian Amora. So he was a rabbi from the generation of sages after the destruction of the temple, where they had made their way to Babylonia and established academies there. And they stopped taking on the title rabbi. That's something that's been reestablished since. So my colleague and friend Ayalon got this far, trying to understand where does the origin of the custom of drinking on Purim come from, got this far and decided that wasn't good enough. And so his solution was to go digging and to go exploring more about who Rava is, what he has to say elsewhere in the Talmud about drinking alcohol in general, about the Purim story in specific, and about Mordechai and Haman as characters. Okay, So that's essentially where we're going with the shiur, is following my colleague Ayalon's path through some of these sources and pulling out the actually really kind of really radical and surprising interpretations that he finds from Rava. So just to preface much of this, I'm going to assume a little bit of familiarity with the Purim story, but I'm also going to summarize right now so that you get a sort of a sense of the prevailing understanding of Purim, I guess how it's most commonly understood. Okay, so in the Purim story, Mordechai and Haman are figures in the king's court, King Achashverosh, and Haman gets essentially a promotion to be the second in command to the king. With this new elevated position, he orders everyone in the king's court to bow down to him. Mordechai refuses, which enrages Haman. Once he discovers that Mordechai is a Jew, which apparently Mordechai just tells him, and that's his reason for not bowing down, Haman decides it's his goal to kill all the Jews in Persia. Totally reasonable, right? There's, of course, an overturning of events, and through Mordechai's cousin Esther and her bravery, they're able to get the king to work against Haman's decree, and they're able to take revenge on their would-be slaughterers, take revenge against the people trying to kill them. Okay. Questions so far? I should say too, since there's a lot of folks here who are not, aren't always regulars in these kinds of shiurim, you can ask me anything at any time. And the easiest way to do that is to just take yourself off of mute. I have the participants list up in front of me, and so your name will just pop to the top. It's sort of like me. I can't always see your video, so waving or movements, I can't always see. But if you take yourself off of mute, you're going to pop to the top of my list, and I'll be able to I'll call on you as soon as I have a moment to take a breath. But I encourage you to ask about anything you don't understand. Ask questions. I would much rather stop and explain things than forge ahead and have you be lost. So how are we doing? What questions do you have so far about Purim, the Purim story, Mishnah Torah, Megillah, anything along those lines? Stephanie, go ahead.
So what are you supposed to do if you can't drink?
Like you're physically not able to?
Like, I've got a bit of fatty liver, non-alcoholic, and so alcohol is not good.
Right. Yeah. Obviously, that's not the kind of thing they got into in the Talmudic era, but since then, you're not supposed to do anything to damage yourself. Just like, for example, when it comes to fasting on Yom Kippur, if you are, if you're pregnant or have other, health issues that would, potentially put you at risk from fasting on Yom Kippur, you don't do it. And in fact, you're not allowed to fast. You have to eat. So I would assume the same thing applies here. If there's, health restrictions that would prevent you from doing this, don't do it. Don't do it. You're not supposed to be putting your health at risk for mitzvah like that.
So grape juice, non-fermented, is not really allowed as a substitute.
Well, the mitzvah is not wine in specific, I don't think. It sounds like, at least from the formulation of Rava here, that the mitzvah is intoxication. Okay. So whether that's with wine or beer or liquor is, less material. He doesn't actually say wine in the Talmud there. That's added in the interpretive translation. That's what the rabbis drank all the time because that's what they had access to. Right. So it's not so much like on Friday nights, making kiddush over grape juice as opposed to wine is fine because the mitzvah is borei pri hagafen, right? It's over, blessing over the fruit of the vine. It's not quite the same type of thing here.
Okay.
Does that make sense? Cool. Yep. Tali.
I wanted to ask, what about other forms of intoxication that isn't like alcohol?
That depends who you ask. That depends who you ask. I think that I don't know. I'm not sure what an Orthodox view on that would be. There are a lot of different, actually surprisingly liberal ideas out there, even from Orthodox authority, about things like marijuana and stuff like that, in terms of its propriety or not. Obviously, that's a question. Also, you know, there's some places where other substances are illegal, and you know, we're not allowed to violate the law of the land in order to do mitzvot. So. Yeah, it depends who you talk to. Good. Any other questions? Okay. So let's look first at Rava's views on alcohol in general, because it sounds like, you know, the way his claim that a person's obligated to get drunk on Purim, the way that's usually understood, and the way we usually understand drinking, is that it dulls your wit, right? It makes it harder to think. Which is why it's kind of surprising for us to read here in a different tractate of Talmud, in very short quotation, source number 4 at the top. Rava again said, Chamra verechana pakchun or pakchin. So wine and good sense, in other words, nice smells, make me wise. So Rava actually seems to think that wine helps us see things more clearly. That's the opposite of using wine to blur our thinking, right? As in blurring the distinction between good and evil. We usually think of wine as dulling wits. But what if we read ad delo yada, the idea that you should not be unable to tell the difference between blessed is Mordechai and cursed is Haman, is actually a sharpening of our thinking about Mordechai and Haman. It's once we're in a state of greater clarity somehow through drinking, that we realize we don't know who's supposed to be cursed and who's supposed to be blessed. So this was the jumping off point for Ayalon's exploration. And it turns out that Rava actually has a lot of other recorded opinions about Mordechai that are pretty shocking in light of this realization about how Rava feels about wine and what its purpose is. Okay. There's a lot to read here, so I'm gonna ask for volunteers to read some of these sources. Could I get a volunteer to read source number 5 there, quoting from the very beginning of the book of Esther? Who can read it? Go for it. Thanks, Emmett.
It happened in the days of Ahasuerus, the Ahasuerus who reigned over 127 provinces from India to Ethiopia. In those days, when King Ahasuerus occupied the royal throne in the fortress Shushan, in the 3rd year of his reign, he gave a banquet for all the officials and courtiers, the administrations of Persia and Media, the nobles and the governors of the provinces in his service. For no fewer than 180 days he displayed the vast riches of his kingdom and the splendid glory of his majesty. At the end of his period, the king gave a banquet for 7 days in the court of the king's palace garden for all of the people who lived in the fortress Shushan, high and low alike. There were hangings of white cotton and blue wool, caught up by cords of fine linen and purple wool to silver rods and alabaster columns. And there were couches of gold and silver on a pavement of marble, alabaster, mother of pearl, and mosaics. Royal wine was served in abundance, as befits a king, in golden beakers, beakers of varied design. And the rule for the drinking was no restrictions, for the king had given orders to every palace steward to comply with each man's wishes.
All right, thank you, Emmett. So this is the very beginning of the book of Esther, and it immediately launches into this description of this absolutely insane party, right? Like, so it was for 180 days, he displayed his vast riches, and at the end, he has a 7-day feast. And it describes the decorations, and it was an open bar, right? You could drink everything on the top shelf. All you had to do was ask. So the Talmud, the rabbis of the Talmud read this passage and read this this description of exuberant merrymaking as absolutely the height of debauchery. So I didn't quote it here because there's only so many sources we can do, but basically the Talmud elsewhere makes the claim that everyone who had anything to do with this party, anyone who participated in it, was involved in such debauchery that they were essentially deserving of death. This was such a ridiculous display of wildness and all this kind of stuff, right? Okay, so basically every opinion in the Talmud says this party is awful, and anyone who had anything to do with it is a bad person. Into that, we read another opinion from Rava. Could I get a volunteer to read Rava's opinion, source number 6 at the bottom? It's Rava's, Melissa, thank you. So Rava's going to be commenting on this verse, what it means to comply with each man's wishes. Okay, go ahead, Melissa, thank you.
To comply, oops. I had to enlarge it to read it. Oh. To comply with each man's wishes. Rava commented on the literal meaning of the verse, which is referring to two men, a man and a man, ish va'ish, and said, the man and man whom they should follow indicates that they should do according to the wishes of Mordechai and Haman. The two of them served as butlers at the feast, and they were in charge of distributing the wine. Why is the verse interpreted this way? Mordechai is called man. As it is written, there was a certain Jewish man in Shushan the castle, whose name was Mordechai, the son of Jair. And Haman, also called man, as it states, a man who is an adversary and an enemy, this evil Haman.
All right, thank you, Melissa. So the key to Rava's interpretation here is these words. There we go. Excuse my poor right-handed doodling here. I'm a lefty. Ish va'ish. So ish is a man. So the way the Hebrew tries to say each and every man, it says literally man and man. And so Rava takes that to mean there were literally two men whose wills must have been followed. Who were they? Mordechai and Haman. How do we know? Well, here we have a verse where Mordechai is called Ish, and here we have another verse where Haman is called Ish. Now let me ask you this: did it ever occur to you, having read Megillat Esther before, that Mordechai would be mixed up in this big party as a butler? Is that in any way called out for by those first 8 verses of the book of Esther? Is there any reason we need to read Mordechai into this? Not really, right? So nonetheless, Rava reads this really over literally, and into the face of this Talmudic tradition that this was a terrible place to be, and that anyone who had anything to do with it, anyone who had anything to do with it was a bad person. So Mordechai was there, but he's supposed to be the hero. He's supposed to be this paragon of piety and virtue, right? This is already kind of shocking. Rava's putting Mordechai and Haman on equal footing in terms of both being butlers and both being party to this no restrictions drinking. And he's doing it in a way that's not even called for by the text. You don't have to read Ish va'ish as referring to these two specific men. You can just read it the way the translation has it. It's just whatever each attendee at the party wanted, that's what they got. Okay, so it goes on from there. Let's learn more about what Rava thinks about Mordechai. Questions about what we've read so far? What questions do you have?
I've got one.
Yeah, please.
No restrictions would normally mean they could all drink as much as they wanted, and if it was free, they'd avail themselves of it. But it could mean that they weren't obligated to. They could use restraint if they wanted to.
Sure. But I mean, if you had access to, I mean, I don't know what your, habits are, but if you had access to the king's personal stores of, fine aged wine.
One drink.
Yeah, okay. You have more willpower than I do, Margaret. Okay.
I have been at events with an open mar, and one drink was plenty.
All right, fair enough. So I don't, I haven't read all of the midrashim on why the rabbis get such a low opinion of this party, but that seems to be the way they take it. I think it reflects more on Ahasuerus than it does on the guests. The fact that he would do this sort of over the top of display of wealth and, frivolity. All right. Okay. So let's keep reading more on what Rava thinks about Mordecai. And to do that, we're going to need to read a little bit more of the book of Esther. Now we're towards the beginning of chapter 2. Could I get a volunteer to read source number 7 there? A couple of verses from Esther.
Sure, I'll read.
Oh, Mark, thanks.
Sure. In the fortress Shushan lived a Jew by the name of Mordecai, son of Jar, son of Shimei, son of Kish, Benjaminite. Kish, who had been exiled from Jerusalem in the group that was carried into exile along with King Jeconiah of Judah, which had been driven into exile by King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon.
Okay, thank you, Mark. So those of you who know your biblical history a little bit, what's this? Who is Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon? What did he do? What is this talking about? Who's Nebuchadnezzar? Richard, or maybe Sari? Richard or Sari?
So Nebuchadnezzar is the one who destroyed the temple in Jerusalem in 586 BCE.
Beautiful. Thank you, Richard. Okay, so Shushan is in Persia. And we know, because we read these verses in not just in their immediate context, but in the context of the whole Tanakh and what we know of corroborating historical records, that the Persian period, when Jews were living in Persia under Persian rule, came after the Babylonian exile by a fairly significant margin. The Persians conquered the Babylonians, and that's what enabled some of the Jews to move back to Israel and rebuild the temple. Many stayed. So where it says right here, let me get my my highlighter up again. Right. Ooh. Right here, where it says Kish, but it's sort of bracketed. That's because the word Kish there is not actually in the Hebrew text. This translation has added that word in to explain who was it who had been exiled from Jerusalem in the group that was carried in exile, along with King Jeconiah of Judah, when Nebuchadnezzar conquered the place, right? Because it makes sense to us that it wouldn't be Mordecai, a guy already living in Persia, but rather one of his ancestors. And Kish here, who is his, let's see, great-grandfather, right? Makes sense that Kish would be the one who it's talking about, because verse 6 doesn't have a subject. It just says who had been exiled from Jerusalem. So we read this and understand it to be talking about Kish because we read in the bigger context. However, the way Rava and the way the rabbis read verse 6, they're not concerned about any of these guys, Yair or Shimei or Kish, the ancestors. They're concerned about Mordecai. He's the last meaningful subject before this verse 6 that doesn't have a subject. So they read Mordecai was exiled from Jerusalem in the group that was carried in exile when Jerusalem was conquered by the Babylonians. Okay. Now in light of that, let's read verse number 8 about how Rava interprets that verse. Could I get a volunteer to read source number 8? Who wants it?
I'll read.
Mary, please, thanks.
Sure. The verse states with regard to Mordecai, who had been exiled from Jerusalem, Esther 2:6. Rava said, this language indicates that he went into exile on his own, not because he was forced to leave Jerusalem.
Okay. So Is that interpretation necessary? Is that interpretation called for here? We know because we read in other books of the Tanakh about what the Babylonian conquest of Jerusalem was like. No one was leaving there willingly. They were dragged off in chains, right? Moreover, we have a perfectly reasonable explanation for who it was that was exiled. That happened generations before Mordecai. But here Rava again is going in and saying, it was Mordecai. This verse is talking about Mordecai. He left Jerusalem. He was exiled from Jerusalem, and not because he was dragged off. He actually voluntarily went. He abandoned Jerusalem. Jerusalem, the most holy city, in Jewish tradition, the most holy city in the land of Israel. And he gave it up. Scary.
Yeah, it's pretty weird because
okay, good.
because I mean, the word exile itself, it's sort of inherent in that word that someone is sending you away. So it is pretty twisted to interpret that someone would send themselves into exile.
Twisted is a good word. Twisted is a good word.
Upside down.
Yeah, absolutely. Right? Yeah, Stephanie, go ahead.
Why does it say, I mean, why couldn't it be that he, as part of the descendants that were taken away, has never made it back to Jerusalem?
Yeah. I mean, you're right. There's no reason to pin, there's no reason for this Josh, right? There's no reason to pin this on Mordecai like that. Yeah, I get, why did he not go back? That's a good question. I mean, if you are gonna make that claim, I think Rava is trying to knock Mordecai down. Right? This is not a good look for Mordecai from Rava's perspective. So we have mounting evidence now that the way Rava understands Mordecai and the Purim story is actually very different from our traditional understanding of Mordecai, the pious Jew, the hero of the story. Yeah? Okay, I have another point of evidence to share. Can I get a volunteer to read source number 9? From a little further on. You recall that one of the plot points of the Purim story is that Mordecai foils an assassination attempt on the king, and this is when that becomes important. Can I get a volunteer to read source number 9? From Esther chapter 6.
I'll do it.
Thanks, Marcella.
That night, sleep deserted the king, and he ordered the book of records, the annals, to be brought, and it was read to the king. There was found written that Mordecai had denounced Bigthana and Teresh, 2 of the king's eunuchs who guarded the threshold, who had plotted to do away with King Ahasuerus. What honor or advancement had been conferred on Mordecai for this? The king inquired. Nothing at all has been done for him, replied the king's servants who were in attendance of him.
All right, thank you. So this is when that previous plot point that Mordecai had done something heroic comes back and is an important plot point, because what happens here is that the king Ahasuerus finds out nothing's been done for him, and he rewards Mordecai by making Haman parade him around town, right? Haman thinks it's going to be about him, but nafuchu, it's the opposite. It turns out it's Mordecai, and it's really embarrassing. And this is supposed to be points in Mordecai's favor. So what does Rava think of this? What's his interpretation? Sue, did you have a question, or were you volunteering to read something?
I was volunteering to read, then I wanted to be sure I was, yeah, sorry.
Amazing. Could you read source number 10 for us then?
Sure. Megillah 16a.
Yeah.
The verse states that Ahasuerus was told with regard to Mordecai, nothing at all has been done for him, Esther 6:3. Rava said, it is not because they love Mordecai that the king's servants said this, but rather because they hate Haman.
Okay, not that anyone needs a reason to hate Haman, but again, is this drash necessary? Here he's claiming this actually had nothing to do with anyone's special love for Mordecai. As we know, it ended up being a big embarrassment for Haman. And Rabbah says that was actually the whole point. It was not because they loved Mordecai so much, they really wanted to honor him. They just wanted to knock down Haman. So again, sort of undercutting Mordecai as this heroic figure, right? Or as even a positive figure. Okay. Questions so far? Do these drashes make sense? Do you see the pattern we're sort of establishing? Richard or Sari?
Yeah, I mean, I do see the pattern that's being established, but it's really, I find this last one very confusing because Haman doesn't seem to have any part in the story at this point. Like the king's servants telling the king that Mordecai was never rewarded for his actions in disturbing the plot. Haman's not even part of that story. So I don't really understand why the king's servants would say it because they hate Haman, unless they somehow have some premonition of how this is all going to roll out. I mean, you know what I mean?
So, right, exactly. This is another one of those interpretations that's sort of not called out for by the text, but Rabbah comes in and asserts anyway. I mean, ultimately, the reward for Mordecai is also an embarrassment for Haman. And there's nothing
but that takes another couple plot points before.
Exactly, right?
So, yeah.
Right. Okay. So basically, that we have this pattern of Rabbah really doesn't like Mordecai, and continues to try to knock him down. Like, why would Rabbah treat Mordecai this way? This goes against everything we've ever understood about who the hero of the Purim story is. So the usual narrative, right, is that Mordecai's a pious Jew, and bowing down Haman because would have been a violation of his beliefs as a Jew in terms of his what he's permitted to do or not do. So let's be clear, let's be explicit. Why is it a problem for a Jew to bow down to Haman? Someone shouted out. Why is it a problem for a Jew to bow down to a human being?
It's not God.
Oh, okay, Andrea says not God. Tali, what were you going to say?
Yeah, I was going to say no idols are allowed.
No idols, exactly. So Jews we only bow down before God, right? Not before anyone or anything else, right? Okay. So we learn elsewhere though in the Talmud, and again, this is something I cut for time. This could be a whole shiur all on its own. We learn elsewhere in the Talmud that a Jew is permitted to transgress any mitzvah, any commandment or prohibition, if their life is at stake. Basically, the idea is the Torah and the mitzvah were given for us to live by them, and therefore not to die by them. So, for the most part, if your life is under threat, you should not martyr yourself. You should just go and do whatever it is someone wants you to do, even if it's a violation of a commandment, and preserve your life. There are 3 exceptions to this, of course. You can't kill someone else rather than allow yourself to be killed. So you can't commit murder. You can't engage in prohibited sexual relationships, and you can't worship idols. So this is the usual explanation, right? It would have been idolatry for for Mordecai to bow down to Haman. That's one of the 3 things where you got to draw the hard line, and it's, you can't succumb to threats on your life and do them. Mordecai couldn't do it, couldn't bow down even if his life was being threatened. He was not only standing up for himself, not only standing up for Judaism as a religion, he was doing exactly what he was supposed to be doing as a Jew who knew his halakha, right? So it's not, well, why would Rabbah treat Mordecai this way? It gets, I think, even more shocking. So it's not that Rabbah thinks Haman is not a bad guy. I think he also agrees. And just before the next passage of Talmud we're going to read, Rabbah basically says, of course, yeah, it would have been a good thing if Haman's ancestors had been killed and Haman had never been born. But, hang on, here we are, okay. But here's this passage from Megillah, source number 11. Can I get a volunteer to read that? I know this one's a bit longer, but you all are doing really well with all the bizarre names. And I think this one's a little easier. Can I get a volunteer to read source number 11? Richard, please, thanks.
Okay. Rabba Bar Chana said that Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi said an alternative explanation.
Oh, you just flipped on the mute there, sorry.
Okay, sorry. Said an alternative explanation. Mordecai's father was from the tribe of Benjamin, and his mother was from the tribe of Judah. Therefore, he was both a Yemeni, a Benjamite, and a Yehudi from the tribe of Judah.
Quick pause.
But rabbis say that.
Hang on, quick pause, Richard. The Gemara is trying to explain why Mordecai is referred to in the book of Esther as both a Yehudi, a Jew, but literally a Judahite, a person from the tribe of Judah, a Yehudi, and also a Yemeni, as we read when he was introduced on the other page. He was descended from Kish, a Yemeni, a Benjaminite. So which tribe is he from? The Gemara is trying to sort this out. Okay, go ahead.
And the rabbis say that the dual lineage is due to a dispute. The families competed with each other over which tribe could take credit for Mordecai. The family of Judah would say, I caused the birth of Mordecai, as only because David did not kill Shimei, the son of Gera, when he cursed him. See 2 Samuel 16.
Yeah, we don't have time for that either. Go ahead.
Okay, was it possible for Mordecai to be born later from his descendants? And the family of Benjamin said in response, in the end, he came from me, as he in fact was from Benjamin's tribe.
Okay, I'm gonna pause you there again, just make sure we're all understanding what's going on. So we have Mordecai named as both Judahite and Benjaminite. So one explanation is, well, he is both. His mother was from Judah and his father was from Benjamin. So since your tribe follows the patrilineal line, he was a Benjaminite, but also sort of had some Judahite influence. And why did the book of Esther choose to say both of those things about him? Well, it was because everyone wanted to claim Mordecai as their own, right? Just the way, I feel like it's like Adam Sandler's Hanukkah song or whatever. Even all the Jews that we can name that we're proud of, when they do good, we're proud of them and we want to claim them, right? Even the ones who identify as half Jewish or whatever, So that's what they're trying to say. Both these tribes wanted to claim him. Don't worry about the part about Shimei, son of Gera. Okay, well, that's another shiur. Okay, go ahead, Richard.
Okay. Rava said, the congregation of Israel at the time said this from the opposite perspective, not as a boast, but as a complaint, remarking, see what a Judean has done to me and how a Benjamite has repaid me. What a Judean has done to me is referring to the responsibility of Judah, as David did not kill Shimei, although he was liable to the death penalty.
In other words, he was supposed to and didn't. Okay.
Mm-hmm. The grave consequences of this failure included that Mordecai was born from him, and it was he against whom Haman was jealous, leading Haman to issue a decree against all of the Jewish people. And how a Benjamite has repaid me is referring to the fact that Saul, who was from the tribe of Benjamin, did not kill the Amalekite king Agag immediately, from whom Haman was later born, and he caused suffering to the Jewish people.
Okay, so this is, I think, the coup de grace in a lot of ways. Rava comes and says, this was not actually a competition to see who could claim Mordecai, but a trying to get rid of him. They were complaining that he had come about it all, and complaining about the problems he had caused for the Jewish people. Now, my colleague Guy Alone, who when he presents this, reads that line I underlined, is basically saying that Rav is saying it would have been better if Mordecai had never been born. I'm not quite sure it goes that far, but this is certainly not a good look. There were grave consequences for for David's failure, the consequence of which Mordecai was born, which led Haman to be jealous and led Haman to decree against the whole Jewish people. So they're saying actually it was Judah's fault that this had, the tribe of Judah's fault. And Benjamin likewise, who failed to cut off Haman's line earlier on, his existence also contributed. So it's actually who's more at fault here, not who gets the credit. Okay. Now let's go back and think about, so first I gotta say, does that make sense? Any questions about how that works? Because this Rosh is kind of complicated. Yeah, right? This is like kind of crazy. Okay, so let's go back and think about Rava's first statement about drinking on Purim. We come a long way from drinking, right? What he said was, a person's obligated to drink on Purim, anda lo yada, until they can't tell the difference between blessed is Mordecai and cursed is Haman. So what Ayalon claims, and what I'm bringing for your consideration today, is that Rava's statement isn't actually asking us to get so sloshed that we can't tell apart good and evil, but actually to question, what is it that you think is good? What is it that you think is evil? Okay. But how could Rava do that and still go against the prevailing interpretation that Mordecai was doing the right thing, and that bowing to Haman would have been idolatry, and Mordecai was actually supposed to die rather than do it?
I have a question.
Oh, please. Yeah, go ahead.
I wanted to know around on the timeline, like when this is all occurring. It sounds like maybe after the destruction of the first temple.
Yes, after the first, before the second. I mean,
Thank you.
there are serious doubts about the historicity of the Purim story. It reads way too much as a farce, as a piece of fiction, to really be that believable as a historical account. But it presents itself as unfolding during what they call the Persian period. So after the Persians had conquered the conquerors of Israel, being the Babylonians, right? So the second temple would maybe be under construction at this point, or operating back in the land of Israel, but Jews were already, there were Jews who remained behind, scattered throughout what's now the Persian Empire, still living their lives in places like Shushan. Is that helpful? Richard, yeah.
The only thing is, Rava is living centuries after the destruction of the second temple.
Oh, was that actually the question and I missed?
Well, I don't know, but just to make a distinction between those two events separated by many centuries.
Yes, you're absolutely right. So yeah, Rava is what they call so Babylon comes up twice. Babylon destroys the temple, and then like 1,000 years later, maybe like 800-900 years later, there are Jews living in Babylon again, establishing academies, and that's when Rava lived and is having this much later conversation about Mordecai. Thank you, Richard. That's absolutely right. Okay. So even if this is the case, even if what Rava is trying to get us to do by drinking until we question our assumptions about what we even think is good and what we even think is evil, how can Rava go against the prevailing interpretation that Mordecai was doing the right thing, right? And that bowing to Haman would have been idolatry, and that Mordecai was supposed to die rather than do that. So what Ayalon did at this point in his research was basically trying to get past the sort of tendency we have to kind of collapse opinions from Talmud into just, what does the Talmud say? What do the rabbis say? And really did some more digging specifically about the character of Rava to get a better sense of who he was and what might lead him to an interpretation like this. I pulled a few of Ayalon's sources, not all of them, because we're already pushing an hour in time here. But I could use it. I think we just have two more. So can I get a volunteer to read source number 12 from Sanhedrin? Melissa, please.
In the case of one,
Another part of Talmud, I should say. Please, go ahead.
in the case of one who worships idols due to his love of another, who requested that he bow down before the statue, or due to the fear of someone coercing him to do so, but not due to the faith in that idol, what is halacha? Abaye says he is liable. Rava says he is exempt. The Gemara explains, Abaye says he is liable because he worshipped it. Rava says he is exempt as a criterion for becoming liable for idol worship is as follows. If one sincerely accepted the idol upon himself as a god, yes, he is liable. But if he did not accept it sincerely, he is not liable.
Okay. So let's review, make sure we understand what's going on here. Side note, Abaye and Rava were chavruta. They were essentially a pair. So just the way, if you've ever read about Hillel and Shammai, or Akiva and Ishmael, they're always set up as foils for one another. So Abaye is making the claim here that engaging in idolatry, even for other motives, even either because you're trying to impress somebody or under duress because you fear somebody and fear what they're going to do to you, that's not okay. It's still punishable and you're still liable for punishment if you do that. Rava here's the dissenting voice. He says it's not punishable unless you really believe it, right? Unless he sincerely accepted the idol upon himself as a god, then it's punishable. But if not, he's essentially saying like idolatry is a matter of the heart, right? If you don't really believe it and you're doing it under duress for some reason, then you're just going through the motions of idolatry. You're not really worshiping it. So therefore, if Mordechai didn't actually believe that Haman was a god, there should have been no problem with bowing down, at least from Rava's viewpoint. Right? There should have been no problem with bowing down to save not only his own life, but in fact the lives of all the Jews in Shushan, all the Jews in Persia who ended up coming under threat because of Haman's decree. So for Rava, Mordechai is not only doing something problematic by not bowing down, he's actually violating a core principle of Jewish law. You're supposed to live by the law and not die by it. This was something he could have done and still, without, he didn't have to lay down his life for this. He should have just bowed down and gotten it over with. Saved everyone a lot of trouble. Not only that, from Rava's perspective, this isn't some kind of pious stand against persecution. Rava sees Mordechai as basically just another minister to the king alongside Haman. Remember, they were both, in Rava's story, they were both butlers at the same feast. He's another guy trying to climb the ladder of power in the king's courts. So it's pretty likely Rava sees Mordechai's actions as stemming not from piety, but from his rivalry with Haman. He doesn't want to bow down because he hates that guy. He's his rival. Not from some sort of like deep-seated commitment to Jewish law. The fact that he pinned his refusal to bow down on his Judaism, he's saying, I can't do that because I am a Jew, is actually throwing all the Jews under the bus. It's actually, in Rava's view, a betrayal of his Jewish values. According to Rava, the law says you, in fact, not only can, but must bow down when you're forced like that. Just don't believe it in your heart. Rava thinks Mordechai is the villain of the Purim story, not the hero. That's nuts, right? This makes the Purim story a lot different from how we usually understand it. And I want to share one more source with you that I think reveals at least how Rava thinks we should understand it. I'll read this last one, source number 13 at the bottom, back in Tractate Megillah, again from the Talmud. So they're discussing here why there isn't a tradition on Purim to recite Hallel. So Hallel, if you don't know, is a collection of psalms. They're usually sung. Actually, it's really fun to sing out the psalms. We sing them on most other happy Jewish holidays. Also on Rosh Chodesh, each new month. But there's not a tradition of reciting Hallel on Purim. And so the rabbis of the Talmud, who already knew this tradition but didn't necessarily know why or where it came from, are having a discussion about, well, why no Hallel on Purim? There's two other reasons been given, and now Rava said a third reason why Hallel is not recited on Purim. Granted that Hallel is said there, meaning on Passover, on Pesach, when recalling the Exodus from Egypt, as after the salvation there, they could recite the phrase that specifically comes up as part of the Hallel, give praise, O servants of the Lord. After their servitude to Pharaoh ended with their salvation, they were truly servants of the Lord and not servants of Pharaoh anymore, right? But can it be said here, in other words, in our Purim story, after the limited salvation commemorated on Purim, give praise, O servants of the Lord, which would indicate that after the salvation of the Jewish people were only servants of the Lord and not servants of Achashverosh? No. Even after the miracle of Purim, we were still servants of Achashverosh. We were still ruled by a king, as the Jews remained in exile under Persian rule, and consequently the salvation, which was incomplete, did not merit an obligation to say Hallel. So Ram is basically saying, it makes sense to say Hallel on Pesach. That was a real redemption. But on Pesach, or on Purim, this isn't some kind of major redemption story. This doesn't rise to that same kind of level. Now, this obviously has pretty big consequences for how we understand Purim, the holiday, and also how we understand, I'm going to flip back now to the beginning line about drinking on Purim. And to be clear, neither I nor my colleague Ayalon are saying to you that you have to agree with Rava. Rava's version of the Purim story is admittedly kind of a bummer. Not to mention, it's the minority opinion. This is not how much most people understand it. But we have this idea on Purim of na'afochu, right? Turning things upside down, changing them. We express this through our costumed identities. We literally are someone else than we normally are, right? The silliness instead of the seriousness. But it's actually that's kind of a narrow understanding of what it means to turn things upside down. On this day, on the day of Purim, out of all the days of the year, we pretend that the way things normally are is a little bit different. But we also know that we're playing a game, that we're pretending things are another way than they actually are. And the next day, things go back to normal. So I think what Rava is asking us to think about on Purim, when Rava says, drink until you can't tell the difference between cursed is Haman and blessed is Mordecai, is what we thought we knew about who's good and who's bad and what's right and what's wrong may not actually be so obvious. We need to question our assumptions. We need to dig deeper. Where do we draw the lines in our lives between our Jewish lives and our public lives? What sort of consequences do our choices about how we act as Jews and what we say, I can or can't do that because I'm a Jew, how does that have impact on other Jews and other people and the Jewish people as a whole? These are the kind of questions I think Rava is trying to get us to ask. And Purim is an invitation in that regard. It's an invitation to sort of blow up the established paradigms, right? The established ways of thinking. And I think Rava is trying to say, actually, a little bit of booze is good for that. So that's the end of my shiur. When you encounter the custom of drinking on Purim, if you choose to participate in that or not, I hope you'll understand that its origins aren't just arbitrary. It's not just silliness for the sake of silliness. It's not just shenanigans for the sake of shenanigans. I think it comes from a really deep place from Rava, who is clearly pretty tortured about this whole Purim thing and the way he's, a character he sees as really not heroic at all, has been elevated by tradition to the status of ultimate hero. This is by no means the only problematic part of the Purim story. We could have lots more discussions about things like patriarchy and male entitlement and all sorts of things. But I think that's where we'll leave it here. Thanks so much for learning along with me, and I'm happy to stick around, answer any questions, hear what you all thought. Melissa.
Thank you. No, I just wanted to thank you.
Oh, thank you. Of course, thank you all so much. what questions do you have? What does this open up for you, or what are your reactions to this kind of thing? Did I successfully surprise you?
Yes.
Yes.
I would say the thing that's going through my head is what was the political orientation of Rava? What was the environment that he was living in there in Babylonia that would push him towards perhaps reframing the whole Purim story in this way? When I read the thing about his opinion about people, that it was okay to bow down to idols so long as they, in their heart, that wasn't where they were.
Right.
I keep thinking about, an environment where perhaps Jews were oppressed, or I think about the Anusim in Spain, being forcibly converted to Christianity and needing to have, show something outwardly when feeling something inwardly, and trying to figure out, so is Rava projecting that kind of an environment on the Jews of Shushan and on Mordechai, and that Mordechai is not behaving properly by kind of, as you said, throwing all the Jews under the bus by, standing up for them?
Right.
Yeah.
I don't know. And I don't know how much deeper the research on Rava as a actual human being goes. It's tough to know too much in terms of biographical details of characters in Talmud, because what we have are these sort of caricatured statements of them, deliberately arranged and kind of manipulated by editors. But I really I wonder the same thing too. And these are definitely questions that previous generations of Jews encountered, is like, how much, as they were sort of interacting with the world around them, how much should they, be Jewish or sort of lean on that versus kind of go along with everything else, for all sorts of reasons, not only because it's easier on a personal level, but it might actually be safer on the whole. Yeah, it's a really good question. I really would love to know too, what were Rava's circumstances that would drive him towards this. I'll give you Ilon's email if you want, because I think he's going to be much better able to answer that kind of question than I am. And I'm sure he'd love to talk to you. He literally gets paid to think about Torah. So, yeah. Other thoughts, Margaret? Did you have something?
Well, with most questions, there's always another viewpoint. If you don't believe in idols and are just going through the motions, presumably between you and God, it's all right. He knows you don't mean it. But sure. One of the arguments against that is that other people will see you. They don't know what you're thinking. They may think you're sincere, and if you're for it, well, then it's all right for them to be.
Good.
And you're setting a bad example.
Good. So there is a somewhat more expanded source sheet. If you, I might be able to link you, but are you familiar with the website Sefaria? Sefaria.org. Okay, so it's essentially trying to be an electronic library for all sorts of Jewish texts. And one of the cool features of it, I use it to create my source sheets. All I have to do is type like, Esther 1:1-3 or whatever, and it'll just pull those verses for me. So you can also save and share source sheets. So Ilon has a sort of more expansive source sheet where he goes into exactly those texts about, and figures out how Rava fits into that conversation about the sort of the appearance of idolatry and the consequences that has. Because it's actually, the rabbis, like the big problem with worshiping idols in public is not so much that I might be an idolater, but that other people might see me do it and think it's okay. Yeah. And then my sort of sin is compounded like that. Yeah. So there's more to dig into there than we had time to dig into today.
Yeah.
But Ilon has also gone on down that road. And I know that he comes to the same conclusion, but I can't take you through all those sources right here on one foot. But I'm happy to link you that if you like. Good thinking. Other thoughts, other reactions?
I thought it was really profound, the concept of saying, well,
I'm a Jew, so I cannot bow down, kind of, as you said, threw other Jews under the bus. I'd never like had that perspective that like can't speak on behalf of everyone else because your interpretation of what to do in this situation is not
sure.
speak on everyone. I think that's really profound, and that can be taken so relevant to so many parts of our own lives where we might think to speak on behalf of a very, very diverse, very so many different interpretations of little different things.
Sure.
But then there's also the thought of like, but you know, there is a community, a Jewish community, however many different communities there are. And so I guess like it just has me, it's not really a question, it just has me thinking on like the different boundaries between like the individual and the community, and where one can and cannot, or like should or should not speak on behalf of the fraught sense of community where, you know, no one even eats food the same, you know, but, you know, so I don't know. What do you think of that concept in general?
I mean, so it makes me think of like the way, I mean, Jews take political positions, and a lot of times we do that because of how we understand our Judaism. You know, I think like the Black Lives Matter movement, for example, is a good example where a lot of Jews feel called to support that because of how they understand what their tradition tells them. And then you know, there's other Jews who don't feel that way. And you know, like when I am public about, I have the opinions and I do the things I do because I am a Jew, that gives a certain impression about everyone else. And when someone else, you know, doesn't know that, they're not privy to all our internal discussions about how we feel and how our Judaism, you know, they just see it like, oh, this Jewish guy is doing it one way and this Jewish person's doing it another way. You know, so the rabbis thought a lot about this, and it's you know, for them it was much more about, well, are you going to worship the local idol or not? You know, the situation's morphed, but I think these are the kind of questions that's still worth asking as we figure out how to navigate, you know, our public and private lives. I don't have clear answers for you on how to do that. I'm sorry.